I'm Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, and last Sunday my sister Melissa looked me straight in the eye and said, "Face it, Sarah, you're going to die alone. You'll never find love because you're boring and invisible." She was laughing when she said it, like my loneliness was the funniest joke she'd ever heard. What she didn't know was that my fiancé was literally circling overhead in his helicopter, about to land on our parents' front lawn. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To truly understand what happened that Sunday afternoon, you need to know how different Melissa and I have always been, and how our family has always seen us. Growing up in Portland, in our modest craftsman house on Maple Street, there were always two versions of the Mitchell sisters. Melissa was the golden child, the one who sparkled in every room she entered, the daughter who made our parents beam with pride at school events and family gatherings. Then there was me, Sarah, the quiet one who preferred sketchbooks to selfies, coffee shops to cocktail parties, and genuine conversations to social media drama. Our parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, owned a small hardware store downtown that had been in our family for 30 years. They worked hard, saved carefully, and taught us the value of honest labor and practical thinking. But despite their grounded values, they couldn't help but be dazzled by Melissa's magnetic personality and seemingly effortless success. While I spent high school working part-time at their store, learning inventory management and customer service, Melissa was crowned homecoming queen, dated the captain of the football team, and somehow convinced everyone that her charm was more valuable than actual work. This dynamic only intensified when we both attended Portland State University. I studied graphic design, spending countless hours in the computer labs, perfecting layouts and learning software, building a portfolio that would eventually land me a steady job at creative solutions marketing. My professors praised my attention to detail, my ability to capture a client's vision, and my reliability in meeting deadlines. I wasn't the flashiest designer in my program, but I was thorough, creative in subtle ways, and clients trusted me to deliver exactly what they needed. Melissa, meanwhile, majored in communications with a minor in what seemed like professional popularity. By her sophomore year, she had discovered Instagram and quickly built a following around her lifestyle content. Her posts about fashion, beauty routines, and trendy Portland hotspots attracted thousands of followers who seemed fascinated by her perfectly curated life. She had an eye for angles, lighting, and captions that made even the most mundane activities look glamorous and enviable. What started as a hobby became her full-time focus, and by graduation, she was earning enough from sponsorships and partnerships to rent a sleek apartment in the Pearl District. The contrast between our post-college lives couldn't have been starker. While Melissa attended influencer events, collaborated with local boutiques, and traveled to exotic locations for content creation, I settled into a routine that felt sustainable and meaningful to me. My job at Creative Solutions Marketing was challenging and engaging, working with small businesses and nonprofits to develop their visual branding. I loved helping a local bakery create signage that reflected their warm family atmosphere, or designing a website for a community garden that captured their mission of bringing fresh food to underserved neighborhoods. To supplement my income and because I genuinely enjoyed the environment, I also worked part-time shifts at the Daily Grind, a cozy coffee shop in the Selwood neighborhood. The owner, an elderly woman named Rose, had become something of a mentor to me over the years. She appreciated my reliability and my genuine interest in learning about coffee preparation, customer service, and small business operation. When the small apartment above the shop became available, she offered it to me at a rent I could actually afford, creating a living situation that was both practical and surprisingly charming. My apartment wasn't much to look at from the outside, but I had transformed the modest space into something that felt uniquely mine. The walls were covered with my own artwork mixed with pieces from local artists I admired. I had refinished vintage furniture found at estate sales, creating an eclectic but cohesive aesthetic that reflected my personality far better than any expensive designer furniture could have. The large windows faced east, filling the space with morning light that made my small kitchen table the perfect spot for sketching while drinking my first cup of coffee each day. The location also meant I was constantly surrounded by the gentle hum of cafe life below. I loved falling asleep to the sound of the espresso machine's final steaming of the day, and waking up to the familiar rhythm of Rose, preparing for the morning rush. The neighborhood itself was a perfect blend of artistic and practical, with vintage shops, small galleries and family-owned restaurants creating a sense of community that felt authentic and unpretentious. Melissa's life, by contrast, seemed designed for maximum visibility and impact. Her Pearl District apartment was all clean lines, expensive finishes, and carefully chosen pieces that photographed beautifully under ring lights. She had transformed her living space into a content creation studio, with designated areas for outfit planning, makeup tutorials and lifestyle shots. Every corner was optimized for Instagram, from the marble kitchen counters that provided perfect backgrounds for morning routine posts, to the oversized mirror that reflected natural light for selfies. Her daily schedule revolved around content creation, brand partnerships, and maintaining her online presence. She would spend hours planning outfits, researching trending hashtags, and responding to comments and direct messages from her followers. The business side of influencing required more work than most people realized, involving contract negotiations, content calendars, and constant adaptation to platform algorithm changes. Melissa had developed genuine skills in photography, writing, and marketing, but the pressure to constantly present a perfect life was exhausting in ways that weren't always visible to her audience or our family. Despite her success, Melissa's romantic life had been a series of relationships with men who seemed more interested in her follower count than her actual personality. She gravitated toward other influencers, fitness models, and aspiring actors who understood the demands of maintaining an online presence, but often treated their relationships as content opportunities rather than genuine connection. Jake Thompson, her most recent boyfriend, was a perfect example of this pattern. He was undeniably handsome, with the kind of sculpted physique that looked great in her Instagram stories, but their conversations rarely moved beyond surface-level topics like which restaurants were trending or which supplements they should be promoting. The relationship with Jake had been particularly volatile, marked by public displays of affection, followed by dramatic arguments that sometimes played out in cryptic social media posts. They would break up and reconcile repeatedly, each cycle generating engagement from followers who seemed invested in their relationship drama. The final breakup had happened just 2 weeks before our family dinner, and Melissa was still processing the emotional whiplash while trying to maintain her online persona of confidence and success. Our parents watched these relationship patterns with concern, but didn't quite know how to address them. They were proud of Melissa's financial independence and impressed by her business acumen, but they worried about the emotional toll of living so publicly. They also struggled to understand why she seemed to choose partners who treated her as an accessory rather than a person worth knowing deeply. Their attempts to discuss this with Melissa usually resulted in defensive responses about how they didn't understand modern relationships or the demands of her career. Meanwhile, my own romantic history had been exactly the kind of quiet disappointment that Melissa loved to point out during family gatherings. I had dated sporadically throughout college and my early 20s, but nothing had developed into anything serious or lasting. Part of this was due to my natural introversion and preference for genuine connection over casual dating. I wasn't interested in the bar scene or dating apps that seemed to dominate how people met in their 20s. I preferred relationships that developed organically from shared interests or mutual friends, but these opportunities seemed increasingly rare as my social circle remained small and focused. The men I had dated were generally kind and intelligent, but we often lacked the deeper compatibility that I believed was necessary for a lasting relationship. There was Tom, a fellow graphic designer who shared my professional interests, but had completely different values around money and lifestyle. We enjoyed working on projects together but struggled to find common ground on bigger life questions. There was Marcus, a teacher I met through volunteer work, who was passionate about education, but ultimately wanted a more traditional domestic arrangement than I was interested in. There was David, not the David who would later change my life, but another David who worked in nonprofit administration and shared many of my values, but simply didn't spark the emotional connection I was hoping to find. Each relationship taught me something about what I was looking for and what I definitely wasn't willing to compromise on. I wanted a partner who appreciated depth over surface appeal, who was interested in building something meaningful together rather than just having fun in the moment. I wanted someone who understood that love required both passion and daily choice, someone who would be interested in my thoughts and dreams rather than just tolerating them. These standards felt reasonable to me, but they also meant that I spent more time single than coupled, a fact that became a frequent source of commentary from Melissa. The dynamic between Melissa and me around romantic relationships had become increasingly uncomfortable over the years. At family dinners, holiday gatherings, and casual conversations, she would inevitably steer the discussion toward dating and relationships, always with a tone that suggested she was trying to help but actually felt more like judgment. She would offer to set me up with men from her social circle, usually guys who had shown interest in her but weren't quite successful or attractive enough to hold her attention. When I politely declined these offers, she would sigh dramatically and wonder aloud why I was so picky or unrealistic about what I could expect to find. These conversations were particularly painful because they often happened in front of our parents, who would shift uncomfortably but rarely intervene. I could see that they wanted to be supportive, but they also seemed to wonder privately whether Melissa might have a point. Was I being too selective? Was I missing opportunities because I was too focused on career and personal growth? Should I be putting more effort into dating and relationship building? Their unspoken questions hung in the air during these conversations, adding another layer of pressure to what was already a sensitive topic. The irony was that I was actually quite content with my single life most of the time. I had meaningful work, creative outlets, close friendships with people like Emma Rodriguez, who had been my best friend since college, and a daily routine that felt purposeful and satisfying. I lived below my means, saved money consistently, and had even started investing in a retirement account earlier than most of my peers. I volunteered regularly at a local literacy program, had season tickets to the Portland Art Museum, and maintained hobbies like hiking and photography that brought me genuine joy. But Melissa's constant commentary had a way of making me question whether contentment was enough, whether I was missing out on something essential by not prioritizing romantic partnership above everything else. Her criticism felt particularly sharp because it played into my own occasional fears about whether I was too particular, too independent, or simply not appealing enough to inspire lasting love. These doubts were usually quiet and manageable, but they became louder and more insistent when amplified by her voice and delivered in front of family members whose opinions mattered to me. The worst part was that Melissa's commentary wasn't just about my dating life specifically, but about preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My entire approach to living, she would make observations about my clothes being too practical, my apartment being too small, my job being too ordinary, my social life being too quiet. Each criticism was delivered with the kind of loving concern that made it difficult to object without seeming defensive or ungrateful. She would suggest that I needed to put myself out there more, try online dating, update my wardrobe, be more social, essentially become a different person, who might be more successful at attracting male attention. What Melissa didn't understand, or perhaps chose not to see, was that I had actually found love, real and transformative love, exactly 6 months before that devastating Sunday dinner. I had found it in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, in a way that proved everything she believed about attraction and relationships was fundamentally wrong. But I had chosen to keep this relationship private, partly to protect something precious from the harsh light of family scrutiny, and partly because the man I had fallen in love with valued privacy and authenticity in ways that made our connection feel sacred and separate from the performance of social media or family approval. This decision to maintain privacy had felt wise and protective for months, but as I sat in our parents' dining room that Sunday, listening to Melissa's latest assessment of my romantic prospect, I realized that my secrecy had created the perfect conditions for her cruelest and most dismissive comments yet. She felt free to speculate about my future with such certainty because she believed she had complete information about my present. She thought she knew everything there was to know about my life, my choices, and my prospects. She was about to discover just how wrong she had been, and I was about to learn whether 6 months of private happiness could withstand the shock of sudden public revelation. For the past 6 months I had been pouring every ounce of emotional energy into building something beautiful and meaningful with David Chen, though no one in my family knew he existed. The secrecy hadn't been intentional at first, but it had become a protective barrier around the most important relationship of my life. David was unlike anyone I had ever imagined ending up with, not because of his wealth, which I didn't even know about initially, but because of how he saw the world and how he made me see myself. We had met at a charity auction for the Portland Art Museum, an event I had attended reluctantly, after Emma convinced me it would be good networking for my graphic design career. I had worn my nicest dress, a simple black number I had found at a vintage boutique, and altered myself to fit perfectly. While other attendees mingled with cocktails and loud conversation, I found myself standing quietly in front of a painting by a local artist, completely absorbed in the brushwork and color choices. The piece depicted a rainy Portland street scene, but with an almost magical quality that made the wet pavement look like mirrors reflecting another world. David had approached so quietly that I didn't notice him until he spoke. "The way she uses light is extraordinary," he said, his voice soft but confident. "Most people try to make rain look dreary, but she's found something hopeful in it." I turned to look at him, expecting to see someone trying to impress me with art knowledge he didn't really possess, but instead found a man who was genuinely studying the painting with the same intensity I had been. He was handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm presence that made conversation feel natural rather than forced. We spent the next hour walking through the exhibition together, discussing not just the artwork but the stories behind the pieces, the techniques being used, and the way certain colors and compositions made us feel. David had opinions that were thoughtful and well-informed, but he was equally interested in hearing my perspective as a designer. He asked questions about my work that showed he understood the difference between commercial design and fine art, and he seemed genuinely impressed when I mentioned some of the local businesses I had helped rebrand. When the auction portion of the evening began, I assumed our conversation would end and we would return to our respective social circles. Instead, David asked if I would be interested in continuing our discussion over coffee sometime. There was something refreshingly direct about the invitation, no games or ambiguity, just honest interest in spending more time together. I said yes immediately, surprising myself with how eager I felt to see him again. Our first official date was at a small coffee roastery in the Hawthorne district, a place I had mentioned loving during our museum conversation. David arrived exactly on time, carrying a small sketchbook that he used for jotting down business ideas and observations. I had brought my own notebook filled with design concepts and random thoughts, and we spent the first few minutes laughing about our shared habit of always having something to write in. The conversation flowed as easily as it had at the museum, moving from coffee preferences to travel stories, to childhood memories, without any of the awkward pauses that usually marked early dating experiences. What struck me most about David was his genuine curiosity about my life and work. He asked detailed questions about the design process, wanted to see examples of projects I was proud of, and listened intently when I explained the challenges of working with small business budgets and tight deadlines. He didn't try to offer solutions or suggest ways I could monetize my skills better. He simply seemed fascinated by the creative process and the problem-solving aspects of visual communication. When I showed him photos of a mural I had designed for a community center, he studied each element carefully and asked about the symbolism behind my color choices. In return, David shared stories about his own work that were equally engaging. He had started a tech company that developed apps for small businesses, focusing specifically on tools that helped local shops and restaurants compete with larger chains. His passion for supporting independent businesses aligned perfectly with my own values, and I found myself genuinely excited about the problems he was trying to solve. He talked about coding the way I talked about design, as both a technical challenge and a creative outlet that could make people's lives easier and more connected. Our second date was a hike in Forest Park where we spent 4 hours walking the trails and talking about everything from environmental policy to favorite books to embarrassing high school memory. David was an excellent hiking companion, setting a pace that felt comfortable for both of us and pointing out interesting plants and wildlife along the way. He had clearly spent a lot of time outdoors and knew the park well, but he was equally happy to stop and examine something I found interesting or take breaks when I wanted to sketch a particularly beautiful view. During that hike, I began to understand that David was someone who paid attention to details in the same way I did, but applied that focus to completely different areas of life. He noticed changes in the weather before they happened, could identify bird songs, and had strong opinions about trail maintenance and conservation effort. He also noticed when I was getting tired before I mentioned it, when something in our conversation had made me thoughtful or excited, and when I was taking mental notes about scenery that might inspire future design work. By our third date, which was dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant that David had discovered through a friend, I was starting to realize that this relationship felt different from anything I had experienced before. There was an ease between us that usually took months to develop, a sense that we could talk about anything without judgment or performance. David had a way of listening that made me feel heard rather than simply tolerated, and he shared his own thoughts and experiences with a vulnerability that felt both brave and natural. The restaurant he had chosen was tiny and unpretentious, the kind of place that valued authentic food over Instagram-worthy presentation. We sat on traditional low stools around a shared platter using injera bread to scoop up various dishes while talking about our families, our career goals and our perspectives on everything from city planning to social media. David mentioned that he tried to keep his personal life private, preferring real connections to public validation, a philosophy that resonated deeply with my own discomfort with Melissa's approach to relationships. It was during this dinner that David mentioned, almost casually, that his company had been more successful than he had initially expected. He didn't elaborate on what that meant financially, and I didn't press for detail. His apartment was nice but not ostentatious. His clothes were well made but not obviously expensive, and his lifestyle seemed similar to mine in terms of valuing experiences over possession. I assumed he was doing well enough to be comfortable, which seemed appropriate for someone in the tech industry, but I had no indication that his success extended beyond a stable middle-class life. Our relationship developed slowly and deliberately over the following month. We saw each other at least twice a week, sometimes for elaborate dates like concerts or museums, but more often for simple activities like cooking dinner together, exploring different neighborhoods, or working on our respective projects while sitting in the same room. David became a regular presence at the daily grind, arriving with his laptop and sketchbook to work quietly at a corner table while I finished my shifts. Rose began to recognize him and would sometimes save his favorite pastries or recommend new coffee blends she thought he might enjoy. The physical aspect of our relationship progressed with the same thoughtful pace as our emotional connection. David was affectionate and attentive without being overwhelming, respecting boundaries I hadn't even realized I needed to set. Our first kiss happened after almost a month of dating, during an evening walk along the riverfront when the conversation had lulled into comfortable silence and the timing simply felt perfect. It was tender and unhurried, the kind of kiss that suggested we had all the time in the world to discover each other. What I loved most about being with David was how he made me feel like the most interesting person in any room, even when we were alone. He remembered details from conversations we had weeks earlier, noticed when I tried new coffee brewing techniques, or wore an outfit he hadn't seen before, and regularly asked follow-up questions about projects I was working on or books I was reading. He had a way of making ordinary moments feel special simply by being fully present and engaged with whatever we were doing together. David's apartment was in the South Waterfront District, in a building that was modern and well-appointed but not obviously luxurious. The space was larger than mine but furnished with the same sort of thoughtful simplicity that I appreciated in my own home. He had an impressive collection of books, ranging from business and technology texts to fiction and poetry, and his walls were covered with photographs he had taken during various travel. The kitchen was clearly used regularly, stocked with high-quality ingredients and equipment that suggested someone who enjoyed cooking as both a practical skill and a creative outlet. We began spending weekends together regularly, sometimes at his place and sometimes at mine, developing the sort of domestic routine that felt natural rather than forced. David would arrive at my apartment with ingredients for breakfast, or I would go to his place with a new design project that I wanted to work on while he coded. We discovered that we both enjoyed the parallel productivity of working in the same space without feeling obligated to constantly entertain each other. Some of my favorite memories from those early months were afternoons spent at his dining table, each focused on our own projects but occasionally sharing interesting discoveries or asking for input on challenging problems. The deeper I fell for David, the more I began to understand why I had never felt satisfied in previous relationships. With him, I didn't feel like I needed to be more outgoing, more fashionable, more anything other than myself. He seemed genuinely attracted to the qualities that Melissa always suggested I should change: my preference for quiet activities, my tendency to think carefully before speaking, my interest in depth over breadth in both friendships and hobbies. David made me feel like these characteristics were assets rather than limitations, strengths rather than social handicaps. We talked openly about our past relationships and what we hoped to find in the future. David had a history of dating successful, ambitious women who shared his interest in business and technology, but he described feeling like those relationships had been built more on compatibility on paper than genuine emotional connection. He had never lived with anyone long-term, and had begun to wonder whether he was too particular or too focused on work to build the kind of partnership he actually wanted. His honesty about these concerns made me feel less self-conscious about my own relationship history, and more confident that we were both approaching this connection with realistic expectations and genuine hope. The topic of his business success came up gradually and in pieces rather than through any dramatic revelation. David would mention projects his company was working on, partnerships with major retailers, or expansion plans that suggested the business was growing rapidly. He talked about hiring decisions, office space considerations, and the challenges of scaling a company culture he was proud of maintaining. From these conversations, I began to understand that his success was significant, but he discussed it with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to talk about hiking trails or restaurant recommendations. It wasn't until 3 months into our relationship that I began to grasp the true scope of David's wealth, and even then it was through observation rather than direct conversation. We had gone to dinner at a restaurant that I knew was expensive, the sort of place I might go for a very special occasion, but David seemed completely comfortable with the prices and service level. The waitstaff treated him with the sort of recognition that suggested he was a regular customer, and he ordered wine with the confidence of someone who was familiar with the restaurant's selection and price range. After dinner, when David mentioned that he had a car waiting rather than needing to call a rideshare, I realized that his transportation arrangements were more sophisticated than I had previously understood. The car that picked us up was a sleek black sedan with a professional driver who greeted David by name and seemed to know our destination without being told. During the ride, David explained that he found driving in the city stressful and preferred to have transportation arranged for evenings out, a preference that seemed reasonable but also suggested a level of disposable income I hadn't fully appreciated. The more serious my relationship with David became, the more I struggled with how to integrate this new part of my life with my existing family relationship. My natural tendency toward privacy had been reinforced by years of watching Melissa turn every personal detail into content for public consumption, and I had learned to protect the things that mattered most to me by keeping them separate from family scrutiny. But as David and I grew closer, the effort of maintaining this separation began to feel more complicated and emotionally taxing. Emma Rodriguez had been my closest friend since our sophomore year of college, and she was the first person I told about David. Emma worked as a social worker for the county, focusing on family services and crisis intervention, which had given her excellent instincts about people and relationships. She was also one of the few people in my life who had never been impressed by Melissa's social media success, and who regularly reminded me that my sister's public confidence often masked private insecurity and anxiety. When I first mentioned that I was seeing someone new, Emma was immediately curious and supportive. She had watched me navigate disappointing relationships and long stretches of being single without ever making me feel like either state was problematic or needed to be fixed. Emma understood that I was particular about romantic connections, not because I was unrealistic, but because I had learned to value emotional compatibility and genuine partnership over the appearance of being coupled or the temporary excitement of physical attraction. Emma's first meeting with David happened accidentally when she stopped by the daily grind during one of my shifts and found him working at his usual corner table. I introduced them casually, and they ended up talking for almost an hour about urban planning and social services while I finished my work. Emma later told me that she had been impressed by David's knowledge of local housing issues and his genuine interest in understanding the challenges faced by families in crisis. She also mentioned that he had asked thoughtful questions about her work without trying to offer solutions or demonstrate his own expertise in areas where he clearly had no direct experience. Over the following months, Emma became increasingly curious about David's background and his apparent financial resources. She noticed details that I had begun to take for granted: the quality of his clothes, the ease with which he picked up restaurant checks, his casual mentions of business travel and industry conferences. Emma had grown up in a working-class family and had developed a keen awareness of economic differences that sometimes made her more observant about wealth than people who had never worried about money. During one of our regular coffee dates, Emma asked directly whether I knew how much money David actually had. The question caught me off guard because I realized I had been actively avoiding thinking about it in concrete terms. I knew his business was successful, I could see that he lived comfortably, and I understood that he had more disposable income than I did, but I had never asked for specific information about his net worth or income level. Emma pointed out that this lack of curiosity was unusual for me, given my generally analytical nature, and suggested that I might be avoiding the topic because I was afraid of what I might discover. Emma's observation forced me to confront the fact that I was worried about economic differences affecting our relationship in ways that might be difficult to navigate. I had always prided myself on financial independence and careful money management, and I was concerned that learning David was significantly wealthier than I had imagined might change the dynamic between us. I also worried that his family and social circle might see me as inappropriate or motivated by financial gain rather than genuine affection, concerns that felt particularly acute given Melissa's tendency to reduce all relationships to their material benefits and social media potential. Emma encouraged me to have direct conversations with David about these concerns rather than continuing to avoid the topic indefinitely. She pointed out that healthy relationships required transparency about important issues, and that money was certainly important enough to warrant honest discussion. She also reminded me that David's behavior toward me had been consistently respectful and egalitarian, suggesting that he wasn't someone who used wealth to create power imbalances in his personal relationship. My parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, remained completely unaware of David's existence during these months, a situation that felt increasingly strange as our relationship deepened. Under normal circumstances, I would have mentioned dating someone new relatively early in the process, if only to deflect Melissa's regular commentary about my romantic prospect. But something about David felt too precious and uncertain to expose to family analysis, especially when I knew that any mention of a new relationship would result in immediate request for details, photos, and opportunities to meet him. Linda and Robert had always been loving and supportive parents, but they had also developed patterns of interaction with their daughters that reflected their different personalities and life choices. They celebrated Melissa's achievements enthusiastically and publicly, sharing her social media posts with their friends and regularly asking for updates about her latest projects and partnerships. Their pride in her success was genuine and well-deserved, but it sometimes made their interactions with me feel more subdued by comparison. With me, their conversations tended to focus on practical concerns: whether I was saving enough money for retirement, whether my job offered sufficient growth opportunities, whether I was maintaining my car properly and getting regular medical checkups. They expressed pride in my work and independence, but in quieter ways that didn't generate the same excitement as Melissa's more visible accomplishments. I understood that this difference reflected their personalities as much as ours, but it also made me hesitant to introduce David into family dynamics that I wasn't entirely confident I could control or predict. Robert in particular had a tendency to ask detailed questions about any man I dated, not from a place of protective suspicion but from genuine curiosity about their character and intention. He would want to know about David's family background, his career trajectory, his long-term goals, and his interests outside of work. These questions came from a place of love and concern, but they also felt invasive when I was still figuring out the answers to some of these questions myself. Robert's interest in David's business success would likely lead to conversations about money and career planning that I wasn't ready to navigate with my parents present. Linda's approach would be different, but equally challenging in its own way. She would be immediately curious about David's appearance, his social skills, and his compatibility with our family culture. Linda had a talent for reading people quickly and accurately, but she also had strong opinions about appropriate behavior and relationship dynamics that didn't always align with more modern approaches to dating and partnership. She would want to know whether David was serious about me, whether he treated me well, and whether he fit into her vision of what kind of man would make me happy long term. The longer I delayed introducing David to my parents, the more complicated the eventual introduction would become. They would wonder why I had kept the relationship secret, what I was concerned about their reaction to, and whether there were aspects of David or our relationship that I found problematic or embarrassing. The secrecy itself was becoming a problem that would require explanation and might overshadow their initial impressions of David when they finally met him. Melissa's presence in family gatherings made the situation even more delicate. She had a talent for asking probing questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to elicit information she could later use for her own purpose. Any mention of David would immediately result in requests for social media handles, photos, details about his job and income level, and opportunities to meet him in person. Melissa would also want to know why I had kept the relationship private, and she would likely interpret the secrecy as evidence that either David wasn't serious about me, or that there was something about him I didn't want the family to know. The most challenging aspect of Melissa's likely reaction was that she would immediately begin offering advice and commentary about the relationship based on her own criteria for evaluating romantic partner. She would want to assess David's attractiveness, his social media presence, his potential for enhancing or limiting my social status, and his financial resource. Melissa's approach to relationships was inherently comparative and competitive, and she would inevitably begin evaluating David against her own dating history and current standards for what made a man worth pursuing. Miss Patterson, my elderly neighbor who lived in the apartment next to mine above the daily grind, had become an inadvertent witness to my relationship with David, through his regular visits to the coffee shop and occasional presence in my apartment. Mrs. Patterson was retired, lived alone, and had developed the sort of friendly curiosity about her neighbors' lives that came from having both time and genuine care for the people around her. She had watched David's increasingly frequent appearances with interest and approval, occasionally mentioning to me how nice it was to see me with someone who seemed to make me happy. Mrs. Patterson's observations were particularly valuable because she had no connection to my family dynamics or personal history with romantic relationships. She simply saw David as a polite, considerate man who treated me well and seemed to enjoy spending time in our neighborhood. She mentioned that he always greeted her warmly when they encountered each other in the hallway, that he was respectful about noise levels and parking considerations, and that he seemed genuinely interested in the community aspects of living above a small business. Through Miss Patterson's perspective, I began to see my relationship with David more clearly and objectively. She noted that he seemed comfortable and natural in my modest living situation, that he didn't act like someone who was slumming or making sacrifices to spend time with me, and that his interactions with Rose and other coffee shop regulars suggested someone who valued authenticity over image. Mrs. Patterson's approval meant more to me than I had expected, partly because she had no agenda beyond wanting to see me happy and partly because her observations were based on behavior rather than speculation about compatibility or long-term potential. The conversation that would change everything began 3 months ago when David started talking more seriously about our future together and his desire to meet my family. What had started as casual mentions of family stories and holiday traditions had evolved into more direct questions about when he might have opportunities to meet my parents and sister. David understood that I valued privacy and had respected my decision to keep our relationship separate from family dynamics, but he was beginning to feel like the secrecy was creating an artificial barrier between us that didn't reflect the depth of our connection. David's approach to this topic was characteristically thoughtful and patient. He didn't pressure me for immediate introductions or demand explanations for my hesitation, but he did express his own feelings about wanting to be integrated into all aspects of my life rather than remaining compartmentalized in certain areas. He talked about his own close relationships with his parents and siblings, who lived in California but whom he visited regularly and spoke with frequently. His family knew about me and were eager to meet me, a fact that made my own secrecy feel increasingly unbalanced and unfair. The catalyst for change came when David's business reached a milestone that required celebration and public recognition. His company had been acquired by a larger tech firm in a deal that would allow him to maintain creative control while gaining access to resources for rapid expansion. The acquisition was covered in local business media and technology publications, articles that included photos of David and detailed information about the company's valuation and his personal net worth. For the first time, I was confronted with concrete information about David's wealth that exceeded even my most generous estimates. The numbers were staggering in ways that fundamentally shifted my understanding of our relationship dynamic. David wasn't just comfortable or successful in the way I had imagined, he was genuinely wealthy in ways that most people could barely comprehend. The acquisition had made him worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a sum that placed him among the most financially successful people in the entire Pacific Northwest region. This revelation forced me to reconsider every aspect of our relationship through a completely different lens, from his transportation arrangements, to his casual attitude toward expensive restaurants, to his ability to take time off work whenever he wanted to spend time with me. The business coverage also included details about David's background that I hadn't previously understood. His company had been developing technology solutions for over a decade, growing from a small startup to a major player in the business software industry. David had been recognized with numerous awards for innovation and entrepreneurship, had spoken at international conferences, and had been profiled in national business publications as an example of successful Pacific Northwest tech leadership. The person I had been dating quietly for months was actually a public figure in business circles, someone whose professional accomplishments were well documented and widely respected. This information created a crisis of confidence that I struggled to navigate without David's knowledge. I began questioning whether his interest in me was genuine or whether I represented some sort of break from his usual social and professional circles. I worried that I had been naive about the realities of dating someone with significant wealth and public profile, and that I was unprepared for the scrutiny and expectations that might come with a more serious relationship. I also began to understand why David valued privacy so highly, as his business success likely attracted attention and interest from people whose motivations weren't necessarily pure or personal. The emotional impact of this discovery was complicated by the fact that David's behavior toward me hadn't changed in any way that reflected his financial resources. He continued to split restaurant checks, never offered to pay my bills or buy me expensive gifts, and seemed genuinely interested in maintaining the egalitarian dynamic we had established early in our relationship. If anything, learning about his wealth made me appreciate even more his commitment to treating me as an equal partner rather than someone he was supporting or impressing with material resources. Emma's reaction to this news was characteristically direct and practical. She pointed out that David's discretion about his wealth was actually a positive sign, suggesting that he was interested in being valued for his personal qualities rather than his financial resources. She also noted that his continued respect for my independence and financial autonomy demonstrated that he wasn't trying to create dependency or obligation through economic means. Emma encouraged me to have honest conversations with David about my concerns and to trust the evidence of his behavior over the abstract worries I was developing about wealth differences. The timing of this discovery coincided with increasing pressure from my family about my continued single status and Melissa's increasingly pointed commentary about my romantic prospects. The contrast between their perception of my dating life and the reality of my relationship with David was becoming so stark that it felt almost surreal. During family dinners and phone conversations, I would listen to speculation about why I couldn't find a suitable partner while knowing that I was in the most fulfilling and serious relationship of my life with someone who exceeded their wildest expectations for what kind of man I might attract. The pressure reached a crescendo when my parents announced that they were planning a family dinner for the following Sunday to celebrate Robert's retirement from the hardware store. This was exactly the sort of gathering where Melissa's commentary about my personal life would be at its most intense and public, and where my continued secrecy about David would feel most artificial and uncomfortable. The dinner was positioned as a celebration of family togetherness and looking forward to the future, themes that made my hidden relationship feel like a betrayal of the family's commitment to openness and mutual support. David's response to hearing about the family dinner was immediate and clear. He wanted to attend with me as my partner, and he felt that we had reached a point in our relationship where continued secrecy was more harmful than protective. He offered to meet my parents privately before the dinner, to attend as my guest with full disclosure about our relationship, or to continue respecting my preference for privacy if I could explain why it remained necessary. His willingness to accommodate my concerns while clearly expressing his own preferences forced me to confront the fact that I was avoiding family introduction more out of fear than genuine practical consideration. The decision to finally tell my family about David felt simultaneously overdue and terrifying. I knew that the revelation would fundamentally change family dynamics in ways I couldn't predict or control, and that Melissa's reaction in particular would likely be dramatic and potentially hurtful. But I also knew that continuing to hide the most important relationship of my life was becoming emotionally unsustainable and unfair to David, who deserved to be acknowledged and integrated into my complete life rather than kept as a secret in one compartment. What I couldn't have anticipated was just how dramatically the timing would work out, or how perfectly David's public arrival would coincide with Melissa's most cutting and definitive assessment of my romantic prospects. The universe seemed determined to create the most theatrical possible revelation, complete with props and staging that would ensure no one could miss the magnitude of how wrong my family's assumptions about my life had been. The subtle changes in family dynamics had been building for weeks before that fateful Sunday dinner, though I was too caught up in my own emotional turmoil about David to recognize them as warning signs. Melissa had been unusually interested in my daily routine lately, asking pointed questions about my work schedule, my weekend plans, and whether I had been spending time with anyone new. Her inquiries felt different from her usual casual nosiness, more targeted and persistent, as if she was gathering information for a specific purpose rather than simply satisfying general curiosity about my life. During our weekly family phone calls, Melissa had started making comments about my appearance and lifestyle that felt more critical than her usual teasing. She would mention that I looked tired in photos Mom had shared, or suggest that I seemed to be working too much and not taking care of myself properly. These observations were delivered with apparent concern, but there was an underlying tone of judgment that made me uncomfortable. Melissa had always positioned herself as the sister who understood style and social dynamics, but lately her advice felt more like a systematic critique of everything about my choices and presentation. The most unsettling change was in how Melissa talked about relationships during family gatherings. She had always been quick to offer commentary about my dating life, but recently her observations had become more pointed and pessimistic. Instead of encouraging me to put myself out there or suggesting potential matches from her social circle, she had begun making statements that felt more like diagnoses of permanent problems. She would mention articles she had read about women who focused too much on career advancement and missed their opportunities for marriage, or share statistics about how difficult it became to find compatible partners after a certain age. These conversations were particularly uncomfortable because they often happened in front of our parents, who would listen with the sort of uncomfortable silence that suggested they weren't sure whether to defend me or agree with Melissa's assessment. I could see that Mom and Dad wanted to be supportive, but they also seemed genuinely worried that there might be truth in Melissa's observations about my romantic prospects. Their concern was loving but misguided, based on the assumption that I was struggling to find connection rather than actively choosing to keep my most important relationship private. Emma had noticed the shift in Melissa's behavior during the few occasions when they had interacted at family events. Emma, with her professional training in recognizing relationship dynamics and emotional manipulation, pointed out that Melissa seemed to be escalating her criticism of my life choices in ways that felt more aggressive than her usual pattern of sisterly teasing. Emma suggested that Melissa might be feeling insecure about some aspect of her own life and compensating by emphasizing my perceived shortcomings, a psychological pattern that Emma had observed in many of the families she worked with professionally. The timing of Melissa's increased criticism coincided with some challenges in her own romantic life that she was trying to hide from the family. Her relationship with Jake Thompson had been deteriorating for months, marked by increasingly public arguments and reconciliations that played out across their social media platform. While Melissa presented these conflicts as passionate romance to her followers, Emma and I could see that the relationship was becoming genuinely toxic, with both partners using their online presence to score points against each other rather than working through their problems privately. Jake had begun making subtle criticisms of Melissa's content and lifestyle in his own posts, suggesting that she was too focused on appearance and social media validation to maintain a genuine relationship. His comments were never direct enough to constitute obvious public humiliation, but they were clear enough that anyone following both accounts could see the growing tension and resentment between them. Melissa responded by posting increasingly elaborate content about their relationship, trying to present a picture of perfect romance that contradicted the passive-aggressive undertones in their actual interaction. The pressure of maintaining this public performance while dealing with private relationship problems was clearly taking a toll on Melissa's emotional state, though she worked hard to hide any vulnerability from the family. During phone calls and visits, she would deflect questions about Jake and focus instead on her business success, upcoming collaborations, and travel plans. But there were moments when her usual confidence seemed forced, when her laughter was a little too loud or her enthusiasm a little too intense, suggesting that she was working harder than usual to maintain her image of having everything perfectly under control. Mom had begun expressing private concerns about Melissa's relationship with Jake, though she was careful not to voice these worries directly to Melissa herself. During conversations with me, Mom would mention that Jake seemed less attentive during video calls, or that Melissa appeared stressed when she talked about their future plans together. Mom's instincts about relationships were generally accurate, and her growing unease about Jake suggested that even Melissa's carefully curated presentation couldn't completely hide the problems in their partnership. The contrast between Mom's subtle worry about Melissa's relationship and her direct concern about my apparent lack of romantic prospects felt increasingly frustrating as I watched these family dynamics play out. I wanted to reassure Mom that her concerns about my happiness were misplaced, that I was actually in the most fulfilling relationship of my life, but doing so would require explanations and introductions that I still wasn't ready to navigate. The secrecy that had felt protective and wise 6 months earlier was beginning to feel like a trap that prevented me from defending myself against increasingly unfair characterizations of my life and choices. David had begun to notice the emotional impact these family interactions were having on me, though I tried to hide my frustration and hurt during our time together. He would gently ask about my mood after family phone calls, or suggest activities that he knew would help me feel more centered and confident after particularly difficult conversations with Melissa. David's emotional intelligence and attentiveness made it clear that he understood I was dealing with family stress, even though I hadn't shared the specific details of what those stresses involved. The most difficult aspect of these warning signals was recognizing that they were building towards something more significant than Melissa's usual pattern of sisterly competition. There was an intensity and purpose to her recent behavior that suggested she was preparing for a more definitive statement about my life and prospects, rather than simply engaging in casual commentary. Emma, with her professional experience in family crisis intervention, warned me that Melissa seemed to be building toward a confrontation, or intervention that would force the family to address what she perceived as my relationship problem. Emma's warning proved particularly prescient when Melissa began making references to the upcoming family dinner in ways that suggested she saw it as an opportunity to address serious family issues, rather than simply celebrate Dad's retirement. During conversations with Mom, Melissa had apparently suggested that the dinner would be a good time for honest family discussions about everyone's future plans and goals. This framing made me nervous, because it implied that Melissa was planning to use the gathering as a platform for more serious commentary about my life choices than her usual casual criticism. The week leading up to the dinner, Melissa's social media content had taken on a tone that felt more philosophical and advice-oriented than her usual lifestyle and fashion posts. She had been sharing content about the importance of honest communication in families, the value of supporting each other through difficult transitions, and the need to address problems directly rather than avoiding uncomfortable conversation. While these posts weren't explicitly about me, the timing and themes felt like preparation for the kind of family intervention that Emma had warned me to expect. Mom's behavior during the final week before the dinner also reflected the building tension,
though she seemed unaware of the specific dynamics that were creating pressure within our family system. She had been unusually focused on planning the perfect meal and creating an atmosphere of celebration and togetherness, as if she sensed that the gathering needed extra structure and positivity to counteract some underlying stress. Mom's dedication to making the dinner special was touching, but it also added pressure to maintain family harmony that made me more reluctant to introduce any new variables like David's existence. The most telling warning signal came 3 days before the dinner when Melissa called me directly instead of participating in our usual group family call. She wanted to talk privately about the dinner and what she described as her growing concern about my emotional well-being and social isolation. Melissa's tone during this conversation was serious and caring, but there was also an underlying certainty about her assessment of my situation that felt both presumptuous and threatening. During this phone call, Melissa explained that she had been thinking a lot about my life and future prospects, and that she felt a sisterly obligation to help me face some difficult truths about my romantic and social situation. She mentioned that she had been discussing my circumstances with Jake and some of her other friends, and that they had helped her recognize patterns in my behavior that suggested deeper problems with social connection and emotional availability. The fact that Melissa had been analyzing my life with her social circle felt like a violation of privacy, even though the information she was working with was limited and largely inaccurate. Melissa's proposed solution involved what she described as a supportive family intervention during the dinner, where everyone could honestly discuss their concerns about my isolation and help me develop a plan for putting myself in social situations where I might meet appropriate partners. She had apparently already discussed this idea with Mom and Dad, who had expressed some interest in finding ways to help me become more socially active and romantically successful.
The thought of being the subject of a family intervention based on completely false assumptions about my life was both humiliating and infuriating. The final warning signal came the night before the dinner, when David called to confirm our plans and mentioned that he had arranged for transportation to my parents' house that would allow him to arrive exactly when I needed him most. We had discussed the possibility of him attending the dinner as a surprise revelation, but hearing him make concrete arrangements made the plan feel both more real and more terrifying. David's calm confidence about meeting my family contrasted sharply with my growing anxiety about how they would react to his sudden appearance and what it would mean for family dynamics going forward. As I lay in bed the night before the dinner, I realized that all the warning signals I had been observing and dismissing were actually building toward a perfect storm of family confrontation. Melissa was planning to use the dinner as an opportunity to address what she saw as my relationship problems. Mom and Dad were prepared to support what they thought would be a helpful intervention, and I was about to introduce a completely unexpected variable that would fundamentally challenge every assumption they had made about my life and prospects. The collision of these different agendas was going to create exactly the kind of dramatic family moment that I had been trying to avoid for months. The carefully orchestrated nature of what was about to unfold became clear to me only in retrospect, as I pieced together the conversations and planning that had been happening behind my back for weeks leading up to that Sunday dinner. Melissa hadn't simply decided to offer sisterly advice during a family gathering. She had been systematically building a case for intervention based on what she perceived as my deteriorating social and romantic prospect. The dinner wasn't just going to be a celebration of Dad's retirement. It was going to be an ambush designed to force me to confront what my family saw as my inability to form lasting romantic connection. The evidence of this hidden agenda had been accumulating in small pieces that I hadn't recognized as part of a larger pattern. Melissa's increased interest in my daily routine wasn't casual curiosity. It was reconnaissance gathering to support her theory that I was becoming increasingly isolated and antisocial. Her questions about my weekend plans, my work schedule, and my social activities were designed to document what she saw as evidence of my withdrawal from normal social interaction and romantic pursuit. Every answer I gave that involved staying home, working on personal projects, or spending time alone was interpreted as confirmation of her diagnosis. Mom's unusual focus on planning the perfect family dinner also made more sense when viewed as preparation for what she understood would be a difficult but necessary conversation about my future. Melissa had apparently convinced Mom and Dad that I needed family support to address what she described as my pattern of self-sabotage in romantic relationships, and my tendency to use work and independence as excuses for avoiding emotional vulnerability. The elaborate meal planning and emphasis on family togetherness was Mom's way of creating a supportive environment for what she thought would be loving but challenging feedback about my life choices. The most manipulative aspect of Melissa's agenda was how she had positioned herself as the concerned sister who was willing to have difficult conversations that everyone else was too polite or worried to initiate. She had convinced our parents that I needed someone to be honest with me about my romantic prospects and social habits, and that she was the family member best equipped to deliver this feedback because of her success in maintaining relationships and building a social media presence. Melissa had essentially appointed herself as the family expert on romance and social connection, despite the fact that her own relationship with Jake was deteriorating rapidly. Emma's professional insights into family dynamics proved particularly valuable as I began to understand the scope of what had been planned without my knowledge. Emma explained that this type of family intervention often occurred when one family member convinced the others that they had special insight into a problem that required collective action. The person organizing the intervention usually presented themselves as having both the expertise to diagnose the problem and the courage to address it directly, while positioning other family members as supportive but less capable of providing the necessary tough love. According to Emma, these family interventions were particularly common in families where one sibling had achieved visible success in an area where another sibling was perceived to be struggling. The successful sibling often felt both superior knowledge and familial obligation to help their less successful relative, even when their assessment of the situation was based on incomplete information or fundamentally flawed assumptions. The intervention became a way for the successful sibling to demonstrate their expertise and reinforce their position as the family member with better judgment and life skill. The timing of Melissa's planned intervention also made strategic sense from her perspective, as it coincided with a period when her own relationship was facing serious challenges that she was trying to hide from the family. By focusing family attention on my supposed romantic failures, Melissa could deflect scrutiny from her own relationship problems while reinforcing her image as the sister who understood how to maintain successful partnership. The intervention would allow her to position herself as the family relationship expert at exactly the moment when her own romantic life was becoming increasingly unstable and public. Jake's involvement in analyzing my situation was particularly galling when I learned about it later, as he had never met me in person and knew nothing about my actual life or personality. Melissa had apparently shared details about my living situation, work routine, and social habits with Jake and their mutual friends, presenting my choices as evidence of social dysfunction rather than personal preference. The fact that a group of social media influencers had been discussing my romantic prospects and developing theories about my emotional availability felt like a profound violation of privacy and family trust. The conversation Melissa had with our parents about organizing the intervention had happened during a private dinner at her apartment 2 weeks before our family gathering. She had invited Mom and Dad for what they thought was a casual meal but which was actually a carefully planned meeting designed to build consensus around her assessment of my situation and her proposed solution. Melissa had prepared talking points about my increasing isolation, my tendency to prioritize work over relationships, and her concerns about my long-term happiness and social development. During this dinner, Melissa had presented what she described as evidence of my declining social engagement and romantic prospects, including my decision to live alone above a coffee shop, my preference for quiet weekend activities, and my lack of serious relationships over the past several years. She had framed these choices as symptoms of deeper problems with emotional intimacy and social connection, rather than simply different lifestyle preferences that reflected my personality and value. Melissa's presentation was apparently compelling enough to convince Mom and Dad that intervention was necessary and appropriate. Mom and Dad's agreement to participate in this intervention reflected their genuine love and concern for my happiness, but it also demonstrated how effectively Melissa had manipulated their perception of my life and well-being. They had been led to believe that I was struggling with loneliness and social isolation, when in reality I was in the most fulfilling relationship of my life and was simply choosing to keep that relationship private. Their willingness to support what they thought would be helpful feedback showed how much they trusted Melissa's judgment and how worried they had become about my romantic future. The specific plan for the intervention had been developed collaboratively during follow-up phone calls between Melissa and our parents over the subsequent week. They had agreed that the retirement dinner would provide the perfect opportunity for honest family discussion, and they had divided responsibilities for different aspects of the conversation. Mom would create a supportive atmosphere and emphasize how much the family loved me. Dad would provide practical advice about putting myself in social situations, and Melissa would deliver the more direct feedback about my behavior patterns and romantic strategy. The fact that this entire plan had been developed and coordinated without any input from me was both hurtful and infuriating when I eventually learned about it. The family had essentially conducted a trial of my romantic life and social choices without allowing me to present any evidence in my defense or correct any misunderstandings about my actual circumstance. They had reached conclusions about my emotional health and relationship prospects, based on incomplete information and assumptions that were fundamentally incorrect, then planned an intervention designed to address problems that didn't actually exist. The hidden agenda also included specific outcomes that Melissa hoped to achieve through the intervention, beyond simply expressing family concern about my romantic life. She wanted to position herself as the sister who was willing to tell difficult truths and provide practical guidance, reinforcing her role as the family member with superior social skills and relationship expertise. She also hoped to motivate me to become more active on social media and in social situations where I might meet men she deemed appropriate, essentially encouraging me to adopt lifestyle strategies that were more similar to her own. Melissa's vision for my romantic future involved what she described as a more proactive approach to dating, including online dating profiles, social events in Portland's young professional community, and potential introductions through her own social network. She had apparently researched local networking events, professional mixers, and social clubs that she thought would provide appropriate venues for meeting educated, successful men who might be compatible with my personality and career goals. The fact that she had invested time in developing specific recommendations showed how seriously she was taking her role as my romantic advisor. The most patronizing aspect of the hidden agenda was Melissa's apparent belief that I was simply too shy, inexperienced, or socially awkward to understand how modern dating worked, and that family intervention was necessary to help me develop more effective strategies for romantic success. She had convinced herself and our parents that I needed guidance about everything from wardrobe choices to conversation skills to understanding male psychology, as if I were a teenager rather than a competent adult woman with her own preferences and experience. The irony of this entire situation was that while Melissa was organizing a family intervention to address my supposed romantic failures, I was actually in the process of planning how to introduce my family to the most important relationship of my life. The collision between her carefully orchestrated criticism and my upcoming revelation about David was going to create exactly the kind of dramatic confrontation that I had been trying to avoid by keeping our relationship private. Melissa's hidden agenda was about to be completely undermined by information that would force everyone to reconsider their assumptions about my life and capability. The morning of the family dinner arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world, though my appreciation for the sunshine and clear skies was significantly diminished by my anxiety about what the day would bring. I had spent the previous evening finalizing arrangements with David, confirming the timing of his arrival and discussing how we would handle the inevitable questions and reactions from my family. David's calm confidence about the situation was both reassuring and slightly unnerving, as he seemed genuinely excited about meeting my parents and sister despite my warnings about potential complications. David had suggested that we keep his helicopter arrival as a surprise element rather than preparing my family for his dramatic entry. His reasoning was that the shock value would actually work in our favor, creating an immediate shift in family dynamics that would prevent the kind of prolonged interrogation and analysis that might occur if we announced his presence more conventionally. The helicopter landing would serve as an undeniable demonstration that their assumptions about my romantic life were completely incorrect, while also establishing David as someone who operated on a different level than anyone my family had previously encountered. The logistics of coordinating David's arrival with the family dinner required careful timing and communication with his pilot Marcus Williams, who also served as David's personal assistant for transportation and scheduling. Marcus had scouted my parents' neighborhood the previous week to identify the best landing spot and ensure that the helicopter's arrival wouldn't create safety concerns or legal complications. The front lawn of my parents' house was large enough to accommodate the landing, and Marcus had confirmed with local air traffic control that the flight plan was approved and wouldn't interfere with any airport operation. My own preparations for the dinner felt surreal, as I was simultaneously getting ready for what I knew would be a family intervention and a dramatic revelation that would fundamentally change how my family understood my life. I chose my outfit carefully, selecting a dress that was nice enough to show respect for the occasion, but not so formal that it would seem like I was trying too hard or had some special reason to dress up. The goal was to appear as normal and relaxed as possible, giving no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Emma had offered to be available by phone throughout the afternoon if I needed emotional support or advice about how to handle unexpected developments during the family gathering. She understood the significance of what was about to happen and wanted to ensure that I felt supported during what would likely be an emotionally intense experience. Emma had also reminded me that regardless of how my family reacted to David's arrival, the important thing was that I had found genuine happiness and partnership with someone who valued and respected me exactly as I. The drive to my parents' house took me through familiar neighborhoods that held decades of memories, from elementary school field trips to teenage adventures to adult visits home for holidays and special occasions. The routine nature of the drive contrasted sharply with the extraordinary circumstances that were about to unfold, creating a sense of disconnection between my external calm and internal anticipation. I found myself paying attention to small details along the route, as if I were trying to memorize the last moments of my old family dynamic before everything changed. My parents' house looked exactly as it always did, with Mom's carefully maintained garden showing the first signs of autumn color change and Dad's workshop visible through the garage window where he was probably making last-minute preparations for his retirement celebration. The normalcy of the scene made me question whether I was making the right decision by introducing such drama into what was supposed to be a peaceful family gathering. For a moment I considered calling David to suggest that we postpone his visit and handle family introductions in a more conventional way that wouldn't overshadow Dad's retirement celebration. But as I parked in the driveway and saw Melissa's car already there, I remembered the intervention that was waiting for me inside and realized that the family gathering was already going to be dramatic and emotionally challenging regardless of David's arrival. The difference was that without David's appearance, I would be forced to endure criticism and advice based on completely false assumptions about my romantic life, with no way to defend myself without revealing information I wasn't ready to share. David's dramatic entrance would at least ensure that the truth came out in a way that was undeniable and immediate. Mom greeted me at the door with the kind of extra warm hug that suggested she was nervous about something, confirming my suspicion that she was aware of Melissa's plans for the afternoon. Her smile was genuine but slightly forced, and she immediately began chattering about the meal preparations and how excited she was to have the whole family together for such a special occasion. The subtext of her enthusiastic welcome was clearly that she wanted to create a positive atmosphere before whatever difficult conversation was supposed to happen during or after dinner. Dad appeared from the kitchen carrying a platter of appetizers, looking pleased and relaxed in the way that suggested he was focused on the retirement celebration aspect of the gathering rather than any family intervention and his genuine happiness about the occasion made me feel guilty about the disruption that was about to occur, even though I reminded myself that the disruption was primarily Melissa's creation rather than mine. Dad deserved to enjoy his retirement celebration without family drama, but Melissa's planned intervention had already made that impossible. Melissa was arranging flowers in the dining room when I walked in, looking beautiful and confident in the way that suggested she was feeling good about her plans for the afternoon. She greeted me with a bright smile and a comment about how nice I looked, delivered with the kind of tone that suggested she was already thinking about the advice she planned to give me about my appearance and presentation. Her behavior was warm and sisterly on the surface, but there was an underlying current of anticipation that made it clear she was looking forward to the intervention conversation. The dining room had been set with Mom's best china and crystal, creating an atmosphere of formal celebration that was both beautiful and slightly intimidating. Fresh flowers, cloth napkins, and carefully arranged place settings demonstrated the effort Mom had put into making the afternoon special,
which made me more determined to ensure that Dad's retirement remained the focus of celebration despite whatever other conversations might occur. The elegant table setting also served as a reminder of how dramatically different David's lifestyle was from my family's comfortable but modest circumstance. During the appetizer course, conversation focused on safe topics like Dad's retirement plans, family updates, and Melissa's recent business projects. The normalcy of these discussions created a false sense of relaxation that made the upcoming confrontation feel even more jarring in anticipation. I found myself paying careful attention to the time, knowing that David's arrival was scheduled for approximately 30 minutes after dinner was supposed to begin, which would place his entrance right in the middle of whatever intervention conversation Melissa was planning to initiate. Dad's retirement stories were genuinely interesting and touching, involving decades of relationships with customers and suppliers who had become friends, challenges overcome during economic downturns, and pride in building a business that served the community's practical needs. His satisfaction with his career and excitement about future projects reminded me of why family celebration was important, and why David's entrance needed to be managed in a way that honored Dad's achievement rather than completely overshadowing it with relationship drama. Mom's nervous energy became more apparent as the meal progressed, with frequent trips to the kitchen for additional serving dishes, unnecessary adjustments to the table settings, and repeated offers of more food or drink. Her anxiety was clearly related to anticipation about the intervention conversation, and I could see her glancing at Melissa occasionally as if seeking confirmation about timing or approach. The tension between Mom's desire to create a perfect family celebration and her knowledge that difficult topics were going to be addressed was palpable and uncomfortable. Melissa's behavior during dinner was particularly strategic, as she made several references to relationship topics and social activities that seemed designed to set up her later intervention. She mentioned recent weddings she had attended, couples from her social circle who had recently gotten engaged, and articles she had read about changing dating dynamics for women in their late 20s. These conversational threads felt like preparation for more direct commentary about my own romantic situation, laying groundwork for the more pointed observations she planned to make. The most surreal aspect of the dinner conversation was listening to speculation about my romantic future while knowing that my fiancé was literally in the air above us, preparing to land in the front yard within minutes. The contrast between my family's assumptions about my life and the reality that was about to be revealed was so stark that it felt almost like watching a play where I was the only audience member who knew how the story was going to end. The anticipation was both exciting and terrifying, as I had no way to predict how dramatically the revelation would change family dynamics. As we finished the main course and Mom began clearing plates in preparation for dessert, I realized that we were approaching the moment when Melissa would typically begin her more serious family discussion. The timing aligned perfectly with David's scheduled arrival, creating a convergence of planned intervention and unexpected revelation that would ensure maximum dramatic impact. The calm atmosphere of family celebration was about to be shattered by forces that none of us could have anticipated when we sat down to dinner an hour early. The transition from family dinner to personal attack happened so smoothly that I almost didn't recognize it was occurring until Melissa's words became unmistakably cruel. As Mom returned from the kitchen with coffee and her famous apple pie, Melissa shifted her posture and expression in a way that signaled the conversation was about to become more serious and focused. She waited until everyone had been served dessert and the casual chatter about Dad's retirement plans had naturally quieted. Then she cleared her throat and announced that she wanted to discuss something important while we were all together as a family. "I've been thinking a lot about our family lately," Melissa began, her tone taking on the sort of earnest quality that she used when creating content about personal growth and life advice. "And I realize that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who need to hear difficult truths, even when those truths are uncomfortable to discuss." She looked directly at me as she spoke, making it clear that I was going to be the focus of whatever difficult truth she was preparing to deliver. Mom and Dad shifted slightly in their chairs, clearly knowing that this moment was coming but still feeling uncomfortable about the direction the conversation was taking. "Sarah," Melissa continued, her voice taking on a tone of practiced sympathy that she had perfected through years of social media content creation, "I love you so much, and that's exactly why I need to be honest with you about some patterns I've been noticing in your life. We all want you to be happy, but I think you've been making choices that are actually preventing you from finding the kind of love and partnership that you deserve. The word deserve was delivered with particular emphasis, as if Melissa was generously offering to help me understand what I was worthy of receiving from life. The setup was so perfectly manipulative that I had to admire Melissa's skill even as I felt my anger build. She had positioned herself as the loving sister who was brave enough to tell difficult truths, made it clear that mom and dad were part of this intervention, and framed her upcoming criticism as concern for my happiness rather than judgment of my choices. The strategy was designed to make any defensive response from me appear ungrateful or resistant to family love and support, while establishing Melissa as the family member with superior insight into relationships and personal development. I think you've become too comfortable with being alone, Melissa continued, warming to her theme with the confidence of someone who believed she understood my psychology better than I did myself. You've created this little bubble with your apartment and your job and your quiet lifestyle, and it's actually protecting you from having to take the risks that real relationships require. It's easier to stay safe and independent than to put yourself out there and potentially get hurt, but that's not how love works. Love requires vulnerability and effort, and sometimes accepting that you need to change things about yourself to attract the right kind of partner. Each word felt like a carefully aimed arrow designed to hit my deepest insecurities about relationships and personal worth. Melissa had clearly thought through this speech carefully, identifying what she believed were my fundamental flaws and presenting them as observations that any caring family member would want to address. The fact that her entire assessment was based on incomplete information and false assumptions made her confidence particularly galling. But I also realized that defending myself would require revealing information about David that would completely undermine her position as the family relationship expert. The thing is, Melissa said, leaning forward slightly to emphasize her point, you're getting older, and the dating market becomes more challenging for women as time goes on. The men who are really worth having get taken off the market in their 20s and early 30s, and what's left requires either exceptional beauty or exceptional social skills to attract. You're smart, and you're kind, but you're not putting effort into the things that actually matter to men when they're making decisions about long-term partnerships. The casual cruelty of this assessment took my breath away, even though I had been expecting something along these lines, based on Melissa's recent behavior. She was essentially telling me that I was aging out of romantic viability, that my personality and character weren't sufficient to attract lasting love, and that I needed to fundamentally change my approach to relationships if I had any hope of avoiding permanent loneliness. The fact that she was delivering this message in front of our parents, with their apparent support, made the betrayal feel even more complete and devastating. I've been watching you for years now, Melissa continued, her voice taking on the sort of patient tone that teachers use with slow students, and I see how you sabotage potential relationships before they can develop into anything serious. You're too picky, too independent, too focused on finding someone who meets all these unrealistic standards that don't actually exist in real life. Real love is about compromise and acceptance, not waiting for some perfect man who appreciates every single thing about your personality exactly as it is. Mom and Dad were listening to this character assassination with expressions of uncomfortable agreement, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement that suggested they found Melissa's analysis convincing and helpful. Their apparent acceptance of this harsh assessment of my romantic prospects and personal character felt like a betrayal that was almost as painful as Melissa's words themselves. I had expected criticism from Melissa, but I hadn't anticipated that my parents would sit silently while she systematically demolished my self-worth in the name of family intervention. The worst part, Melissa said, building toward what I sensed was going to be her most devastating observation, is that I think you've actually convinced yourself that this lifestyle is working for you. You've romanticized being alone and independent, made it into some kind of noble choice instead of acknowledging that it's actually just fear disguised as preference. You'd rather live in that tiny apartment above a coffee shop working your modest little job and spending weekends by yourself than take the emotional risks that might lead to real partnership and family. The dismissive way she described my life and choices was designed to make everything I valued about my independence and career seem small and pathetic by comparison to her vision of what adult success should look like.
My apartment wasn't a charming space that I had made my own, it was tiny. My job wasn't meaningful work that I found fulfilling. It was modest little. My preference for quiet weekends wasn't a reflection of my personality and interests. It was evidence of social dysfunction and emotional avoidance. I know this is hard to hear, Melissa said, her voice softening with false compassion. But somebody needs to love you enough to tell you the truth. You're 28 years old. Sarah, you're running out of time to find someone and build the kind of life that will actually make you happy in the long run. Your age who are worth having are looking for women who bring energy and social connections and excitement to their lives. Not someone who's content to hide away with her books and her design projects like some kind of antisocial hermit. The word hermit hung in the air like a physical slap, reducing my entire personality and lifestyle to a pathological condition that explained my romantic failures. Melissa had managed to take every quality that David loved about me. My thoughtfulness, my independence, my preference for meaningful activities over social performance, and reframe them as character defects that prevented me from forming lasting relationships. The systematic nature of this attack felt particularly cruel because it was delivered with the pretense of loving concern rather than obvious malice. The reality is, Melissa continued, apparently building toward her final devastating observation, that if you don't make some serious changes to your approach and your expectations, you're going to end up alone. Not temporarily alone while you wait for the right person, but permanently alone because you've waited too long and become too set in your ways to attract someone worth having. Face it, Sarah, with the way you're living your life right now, you're going to die alone. You'll never find love because you're boring and invisible, and men can sense that about you. She was laughing as she delivered this final assessment, as if my potential lifelong loneliness was genuinely amusing to her rather than tragic. The laughter was the most cruel element of the entire attack, suggesting that my romantic prospects were so obviously hopeless that they had become a source of entertainment rather than concern. The sound of her amusement at my expense created a moment of perfect, crystallized hatred that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening, with Mom and Dad looking uncomfortable but not disagreeing with Melissa's assessment, and me sitting frozen in shock at the completeness of the character assassination I had just experienced. Everything about my personality, my lifestyle, my choices, and my prospects had been systematically demolished by someone who claimed to love me, with the apparent support of parents who were supposed to value and protect me regardless of my romantic status. The sound that interrupted Melissa's cruel laughter was so unexpected and powerful that it literally shook the windows of my parents' dining room. The rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades grew louder and more distinct with each passing second, creating a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to emanate from directly above our house. The four of us froze in our chairs, looking upward as if we could see through the ceiling to identify the source of this increasingly loud and intrusive noise that was drowning out all possibility of continued conversation. Dad was the first to speak, his voice raised to compete with the growing volume of the helicopter engine. "What in the world is that?" he asked, pushing back from the table and moving toward the front window where he could peer out at the front yard. Mom followed close behind him, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm as she realized that whatever aircraft was approaching seemed to be preparing to land on their property rather than simply flying overhead toward the nearby airport. Melissa's confident smirk had disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of bewilderment and annoyance that someone else's drama was interrupting her carefully orchestrated intervention. She remained seated at the table, but her posture had shifted from relaxed authority to tense attention, as she tried to understand what was happening and how it might affect her plans for the remainder of our family gathering. The possibility that this helicopter arrival had anything to do with me clearly hadn't occurred to her, as she was still operating under the assumption that I was exactly the socially isolated and romantically hopeless person she had just finished describing. The helicopter's approach was expertly executed, with the pilot bringing the aircraft down in a smooth, controlled descent that demonstrated both professional skill and familiarity with residential landing procedures. Through the front windows, we could see the aircraft settling onto the center of my parents' front lawn, its rotors creating a powerful downdraft that bent the surrounding grass and shrubs dramatically but without causing any apparent damage to Mom's carefully maintained landscape. The positioning was perfect. Close enough to the house to create maximum visual impact, but far enough away to ensure safety and minimize disruption to the neighborhood. As the engine noise gradually decreased and the rotors began to slow, We could see that this was not some emergency medical helicopter or news aircraft, but rather a sleek, expensive-looking private helicopter that suggested wealth and importance rather than crisis or accident. The aircraft's pristine condition and sophisticated design made it clear that whoever had arranged this dramatic arrival had both significant financial resources and access to high-end transportation services that were well beyond anything my middle-class family had ever encountered directly. The helicopter door opened with smooth precision, and David emerged with the kind of calm confidence that suggested this mode of transportation was routine for him rather than an extraordinary gesture designed to impress my family. He was dressed impeccably in a well-tailored suit that struck the perfect balance between business formality and social appropriateness, looking exactly like someone who belonged in a helicopter and was comfortable making dramatic entrances at family gatherings. His appearance was polished and sophisticated without being ostentatious, demonstrating the kind of understated elegance that comes with genuine wealth rather than the need to prove financial status. Marcus Williams, David's pilot and assistant, remained in the aircraft to monitor the engine and ensure that the helicopter was secure during what was clearly planned as a brief visit rather than an extended stay. Through the cockpit windows, we could see Marcus completing post-landing procedures with the professional efficiency that suggested this type of residential arrival was well within his normal range of responsibility. The smooth coordination between David and Marcus demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that made it clear this wasn't some impulsive gesture but rather a carefully planned arrival executed with military precision. David approached the front door with purposeful strides, carrying a small bouquet of flowers that he had clearly selected specifically for this introduction to my family. His expression was warm and slightly nervous in the way that suggested he understood the significance of this moment for our relationship while remaining confident about his ability to handle whatever reactions he might encounter. The combination of dramatic arrival method and thoughtful personal gesture created exactly the sort of memorable first impression that would ensure my family could never dismiss or minimize his importance in my life. The doorbell rang with perfect timing just as the four of us were beginning to recover from our shock at the helicopter landing and starting to formulate questions about what was happening and why someone was making such an elaborate arrival at our modest family gathering. Dad answered the door with the sort of cautious politeness that suggested he was prepared for anything from government officials to news reporters to explain the unexpected aircraft in his front yard. "Good afternoon," David said with genuine warmth and respect, extending his hand to Dad with the sort of firm, confident handshake that immediately communicated both good intentions and strong character. "You must be Robert. I'm David Chen, and I'm here to meet Sarah's family. I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but I wanted to make sure I didn't miss this important family celebration." His voice carried exactly the right tone of respect for Dad, combined with confidence in his own right to be there, creating an immediate dynamic of mutual regard rather than defensive explanation or awkward intrusion. Dad's expression shifted from confusion to recognition as he processed David's words and realized that this well-dressed stranger claiming to know me was apparently the explanation for the helicopter currently occupying his front lawn. "You're here for Sarah?" Dad asked, his voice carrying a mix of surprise and curiosity that suggested he was rapidly recalibrating his understanding of the current situation. The fact that someone had arrived by helicopter specifically to meet his family in connection with his daughter was clearly not something Dad had any framework for processing based on his previous life experience. "Yes, sir," David replied with the sort of respectful directness that immediately communicated both good manners and genuine confidence. "Sarah and I have been together for 6 months now, and I've been looking forward to meeting the family that raised such an extraordinary woman. I hope you don't mind the unconventional arrival, but I wanted to make sure I could be here for your retirement celebration." The ease with which David acknowledged both our relationship and his understanding of the family occasion demonstrated exactly the sort of thoughtfulness and social awareness that characterized his approach to every aspect of our partnership. Mom appeared beside Dad in the doorway, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to amazement as she took in David's appearance and processed his explanation for being there. 6 months, she repeated, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that suggested she was struggling to reconcile this information with her previous understanding of my romantic life. The flowers in David's hand and his obvious comfort with making family introductions clearly indicated that this was a serious relationship rather than some casual dating arrangement that might explain why I hadn't mentioned him previously. "Mom, Dad," I said, finally finding my voice and moving toward the front door where this introduction was taking place. "I'd like you to meet David Chen, my fiancé." The word fiancé created a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch far longer than the few seconds it actually lasted. I could see my parents processing this information with the sort of shocked attention that suggested they were questioning whether they had heard correctly or if I had somehow misspoken in my nervousness about this unexpected introduction. Melissa's voice cut through the silence with a sharp note of disbelief that bordered on outrage. "Fiancé," she demanded, rising from her chair at the dining table and moving toward the front door with the sort of aggressive body language that suggested she felt personally betrayed by this revelation. "What do you mean, fiancé? You don't have a fiancé. You just said 5 minutes ago that you were going to die alone because you can't find anyone who would want to be with you." "Actually," I replied with the sort of calm confidence that I had never been able to access during previous family confrontations, "I never said any of those. You said all of that. I just sat here and listened while you explained to everyone why you thought I was destined for permanent loneliness." The contrast between Melissa's obvious agitation and my newfound composure was immediately apparent to everyone present, creating a shift in family dynamics that felt both liberating and long overdue. David stepped forward slightly, positioning himself in a way that communicated support for me while remaining respectful toward my family. "I'm sorry if my arrival has caused any confusion," he said with diplomatic grace, "but I wanted to be here to meet the people who are most important to Sarah. She's told me so much about your family, and I've been looking forward to this opportunity ever since she mentioned your retirement celebration, Robert." The mention of advanced knowledge about Dad's retirement made it clear that my relationship with David was not some sudden development that could be dismissed as impulsive or insignificant. The fact that we had been discussing family events and planning around family celebrations indicated the sort of integration and future planning that characterized serious partnerships rather than casual dating relationships. This detail also subtly corrected any assumption that David's appearance was coincidental or unrelated to genuine interest in becoming part of my family life. Dad, recovering his composure with the sort of practical grace that had always characterized his approach to unexpected situations, extended his hand again to David with a more genuine welcome. "Well, David, this is certainly a surprise, but any friend of Sarah's is welcome in our home, though I have to ask about the helicopter. That's not something we see every day in this neighborhood." His tone carried curiosity rather than judgment, suggesting that he was more interested in understanding this extraordinary arrival than in criticizing. "I own a technology company," David explained simply, "and the helicopter makes it easier to manage my schedule when I need to be in multiple locations in a single day. Today I wanted to make sure I could be here for this celebration while still handling some business obligations this morning. I hope it didn't cause too much disruption to your neighbors." His explanation was matter-of-fact without being boastful, providing enough information to satisfy curiosity while maintaining the sort of understated approach to wealth that had characterized our entire relationship. Mom was studying David with the sort of intense attention that suggested she was rapidly reassessing everything she thought she knew about my life and romantic prospects. 6 months, she repeated again, this time with a tone that suggested she was trying to understand how such a significant relationship could have existed without her knowledge. "Sarah, why didn't you tell us you were seeing someone and engage?" Her voice carried hurt along with confusion, making it clear that she felt excluded from important developments in my life. "I wanted to keep our relationship private while we got to know each other," I explained, feeling more confident and articulate than I had during any previous family discussion about my personal life. "David values privacy, and I thought it was important to build something real together before introducing the complications of family opinions and expectations." The honesty of this explanation was designed to address their hurt feelings while also establishing that my decision to maintain secrecy had been deliberate and thoughtful rather than defensive or shameful. Melissa was clearly struggling to process this complete reversal of her understanding of my romantic situation, and her response carried a note of desperate skepticism that suggested she was looking for ways to diminish or dismiss what she was seeing. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "You can't just have a secret fiancé. People don't work that way. Relationships that matter get shared with family. If this was real, we would have known about it." "Actually," David said with gentle firmness, "Sarah and I both value authentic connection over public validation. We've spent the past 6 months building something meaningful together, and we felt that was more important than managing other people's opinions about our relationship." His response was designed to support my decision while also subtly criticizing the approach to relationships that prioritized public recognition over private development. The implications of David's words were not lost on Melissa, who clearly recognized that his philosophy about authentic connection was a direct contradiction of her social media-focused approach to romance and partnership. His suggestion that private development was more valuable than public validation fundamentally challenged the premise that had guided her own relationship choices and her criticism of my romantic life. The fact that this critique was coming from someone who had clearly achieved the sort of romantic success that she had insisted was impossible for me made it particularly threatening to her position as the family relationship expert. Dad was looking back and forth between the helicopter on his front lawn and David standing in his doorway, with the sort of amazed expression that suggested he was still trying to fully process the implications of what was happening. "Technology company," he repeated, thoughtfully. "That must be quite successful if you're able to afford private helicopter transportation." His observation was practical rather than intrusive, reflecting genuine curiosity about David's background rather than suspicion about his motive. "I've been fortunate," David replied with the sort of modest acknowledgement that characterized how he discussed his financial success. "The company has grown beyond what I initially expected, but the real achievement has been finding someone like Sarah who values the person I am rather than what I've accomplished professionally." His ability to redirect attention from his wealth to our relationship demonstrated exactly the sort of emotional intelligence and genuine priorities that had made me fall in love with him in the first place. Mom stepped forward with the sort of gracious hostility that she had always used to welcome unexpected guests, though her expression still carried traces of shock at the circumstances of this introduction. "David, would you like to join us for dessert?" We were just finishing dinner, and Robert was sharing some stories about his retirement plans. Her invitation was genuine despite the unusual circumstances, reflecting her basic belief that family gatherings should include anyone who was important to her children. "I would be honored," David replied with sincere appreciation, "though I should mention that Marcus needs to return the helicopter to the airport within the next hour for air traffic reasons. Would it be possible for me to arrange alternative transportation back to the city?" His practical consideration of logistics while accepting the family invitation demonstrated exactly the sort of thoughtfulness and planning ability that characterized his approach to every aspect of life. Melissa was still standing near the dining table, her posture rigid with the sort of barely controlled frustration that suggested she was struggling to understand how her carefully orchestrated intervention had been so completely undermined by developments she couldn't have anticipated. "This is insane," she said, her voice carrying a note of desperate disbelief. "You can't just show up in a helicopter and expect everyone to pretend that this changes anything about Sarah's fundamental problems with relationships and social connection. What problems would those?" David asked with genuine curiosity, turning his attention to Melissa with the sort of polite interest that suggested he was willing to engage with her concerns in good faith. His question was perfectly calibrated to force Melissa to either repeat her harsh criticism in front of the person she had been criticizing, or to acknowledge that her assessment might have been based on incomplete information. The silence that followed David's question was profound and uncomfortable, as Melissa realized that she was being asked to defend her characterization of my romantic prospects to someone who had clearly found me worthy of both love and merit. The confidence that had carried her through the intervention conversation had completely evaporated,
replaced by the sort of defensive uncertainty that came from having her expertise challenged by undeniable contrary evidence. "I think," Mom said diplomatically, clearly recognizing that the family dynamic had shifted dramatically and that continued conflict would be inappropriate given the circumstances, "that we should focus on celebrating Dad's retirement and getting to know Dave. There's obviously been some misunderstanding about Sarah's personal life, but that can be sorted out later." Her intervention was designed to restore family harmony while acknowledging that previous assumptions had been incorrect. Dad nodded in agreement with Mom's diplomatic approach, his expression suggesting that he was more interested in learning about David and understanding this new family development than in dwelling on whatever misunderstandings had occurred. "David, I'd love to hear more about your technology company. What kind of problems does your software solve?" His question reflected genuine curiosity about David's work while also demonstrating the sort of practical focus that had always characterized his approach to getting to know new people. As we moved back toward the dining table, with David easily integrating into the family conversation and Melissa struggling to adjust to her completely altered position in the family hierarchy, I realized that this dramatic revelation had accomplished far more than simply correcting my family's misunderstandings about my romantic life. David's arrival had fundamentally shifted the power dynamics that had governed our family relationships for years, establishing me as someone who was capable of inspiring devoted love from an exceptional partner rather than someone who needed family intervention to address romantic failure. The conversation that followed was remarkably natural and engaging, with David demonstrating exactly the sort of genuine interest in my family and thoughtful questions about their lives that made it clear why I had fallen in love with him. He asked Dad about the details of running a hardware store, listened with real attention to Mom's stories about community involvement, and managed to navigate even Melissa's hostile questions with grace and humor that gradually disarmed her defensive attitude. By the time David's transportation arrived to take him back to the city, my parents were clearly charmed by his combination of success and humility, impressed by his obvious devotion to me, and curious about our wedding plans and future together. The transformation in family dynamics was so complete that it felt like we were entirely different people than we had been 3 hours earlier when Melissa had been confidently explaining why I was destined for permanent loneliness. The most remarkable aspect of the entire experience was realizing that David's dramatic arrival had not just corrected my family's misunderstandings about my romantic life, but had also revealed the extent to which those misunderstandings had been based on assumptions and judgments that said more about my family's limitations than about my actual circumstance. Melissa's intervention had been based on the premise that she understood relationships better than I did, but David's presence made it clear that I had actually found exactly the sort of partnership that she had insisted was impossible for someone like me. As David prepared to leave, he thanked my parents for their hospitality and expressed genuine enthusiasm about future family gatherings and opportunities to build relationships with the people who were most important to me. His departure was warm and natural, with firm handshakes for Dad, a hug for Mom, and even a polite goodbye for Melissa that suggested he bore no ill will despite her earlier hostility. After the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the afternoon sky, the four of us stood in the front yard looking at the flattened grass that marked where David's aircraft had landed. The physical evidence of his visit made it impossible to dismiss the afternoon's events as some sort of shared hallucination or elaborate practical joke, forcing everyone to acknowledge that my life was fundamentally different than they had believed. The conversation that followed David's departure was awkward but necessary, involving apologies from Mom and Dad for their participation in what they now understood had been an unwarranted intervention, and a much more subdued Melissa acknowledging that she had been working with incomplete information about my personal circumstances. The recognition that I had been in a serious relationship while they were planning to address my supposed romantic failures forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about my life and their understanding of what I needed from family support. 6 months later, as I write this story from the home David and I now share together, I can see that the helicopter landing was the perfect metaphor for what our relationship brought to my life. David didn't just arrive in my world, he transformed it completely, elevating everything about my daily experience while remaining grounded in the values and priorities that had attracted us to each other in the first place. Our wedding was a beautiful celebration that included my family as honored guests rather than skeptical observers, and the genuine happiness they expressed about our partnership felt like complete vindication of my decision to trust my own judgment about love and relationship. Melissa's perspective on relationships has evolved significantly since that Sunday afternoon, partly as a result of her own relationship with Jake finally ending permanently and partly because of witnessing what authentic partnership actually looks like when it's built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than social media potential and public validation. She has become more supportive of my choices and more questioning of her own assumptions about what makes relationships successful, though she still occasionally struggles with the reality that her expertise about romance was not as comprehensive as she had believed. The most important lesson I learned from that experience was that sometimes the people who claim to know us best actually know us least, especially when their knowledge is filtered through their own insecurities and assumptions about what our lives should look like. Melissa's intervention was based on the premise that she understood my circumstances and prospects better than I did, but her confidence was entirely misplaced because she was working with incomplete information and false assumptions about what I valued and what I was capable of achieving. The helicopter landing became family legend, a story that gets told at every gathering with increasing embellishment and humor as time passes and the initial shock fades into fond memory. Dad particularly enjoys describing the moment when the aircraft appeared overhead, and Mom loves talking about how gracious David was despite the unusual circumstances of the introduction. Even Melissa has learned to laugh about her timing in delivering relationship advice just moments before a helicopter landed to prove her completely wrong. Most importantly, that afternoon taught me that authentic happiness doesn't require anyone else's approval or understanding, and that the right partner will enhance rather than diminish the qualities that make you who you are. David's love didn't require me to become more social, more conventional, or more like Melissa in order to be worthy of partnership. Instead, his love celebrated exactly the characteristics that Melissa had identified as romantic liabilities, proving that the right person will always see your perceived weaknesses as strengths and your differences as assets rather than obstacles. The confidence I gained from that experience has influenced every aspect of my life, from my career advancement to my friendships to my continued relationship with my family. Knowing that I was capable of inspiring devoted love from someone exceptional gave me permission to trust my own judgment about other important decisions, and to stop seeking external validation for choices that felt right for my personality and value. Today, when I encounter people who are struggling with family criticism or social pressure about their life choices, I always remember that Sunday afternoon when everything changed in the space of a helicopter land. Sometimes the most powerful response to criticism is simply living your authentic life with confidence and allowing your results to speak for themselves. The truth has a way of revealing itself dramatically when the time is right, and the people who truly love you will always be capable of admitting when they were wrong and celebrating when you prove them incorrect in the most wonderful possible way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.